The Health and Social Care Bill was passed last year. Its significance was not very plain to many people, unfortunately. They looked at it and they couldn't find the thing in it that was actually going to accomplish the privatisation. Because really the only marker of it was a little clause explaining that regulations would be issued. And now those regulations are with us. The regulations show that everything has to be put out to competitive markets by clinical commissioning groups, the CCGs and the National Commissioning Board, and therefore that will create rights for private providers to supply, which will not only allow them to take quite a lot of the share of the NHS budget for their business right now, it also potentially makes the privatisation irreversible in the future. The health service is being restructured onto an insurance-compatible footing, and the CCGs are technically state-owned insurance schemes. So they're going to be taking on around 80% of the NHS budget, and they're going to be parcelling it out to providers. It's not suddenly overnight going to turn into a privatised service on 1st of April. What happens on 1st of April is a bunch of legal changes and a bunch of operational changes, finishing the transition away from the original form of funding of the NHS and moving into a market system which is going to be full-on market. And the rules are structured in such a way that there will be a gradual transition. The public sector will shrink away and the private sector will grow. So what will happen is a lot of private providers coming into the health service and a lot of public providers going bust. Because every time the public provider of a service does not get the contract to carry on providing that service because a private provider has got it instead, that service will be shut down permanently because there won't be any more money to pay the staff or to keep the lights on. So gradually this system will kill off all our traditional NHS providers, apart from maybe some big names. But because there will never be an announcement in Parliament that the NHS is privatised, and because the private providers will be allowed to use the NHS logo for anything that they are getting NHS funding for, it is very likely that the general public will not be aware that the private sector has in fact come in and taken over whatever bits of the NHS it finds profitable, until probably service provision gets very bad. But at that point, of course, the private providers just take the NHS logo off, and then they will enjoy the boost to business that will come with the terrible reputation the NHS will have by then. Both theoretically and practically, we know absolutely for certain that organising healthcare as a public sector service is the cheapest and most effective way of providing healthcare. And that is broadly because the market model does not at all well fit healthcare. The market model depends on a tension, a power balance between a consumer and a supplier. And that market model also includes assumptions that both parties are in possession of all information about the subject of the transaction. Well, that's clearly not the case when one goes to the doctor, because unless you're also medically trained, what you're wanting to know is what it is that should be purchased to improve your health, as well as making an arrangement to do that. So in markets where that's the situation, where the consumer has to rely upon the supplier for guidance, what you get isn't a market that clears down to a minimum price and is efficient. What you get is soar away inflation and abuse within that market. If you pay doctors only when they do work, then they overtreat people. If you make sure that medical facilities have no way of making any money other than by selling things, then they become salesmen, not advisors and advocates to the public. The government has been very careful to muddy the water here and make out that a public healthcare provider is pretty equivalent to a private sector healthcare provider, but actually their goals are completely different. In the public sector, doctors attempt to arrange to have enough money to treat the medical needs of the people that come to them for help. The purpose is treatment, and the money is a means to an end. Once you move into the private sector, company law forces company staff to prioritise making money for the shareholders above everything else. Not only can they be fired if they don't, they're breaking the law. The whole system is about making money. And actually, in the world, we have one of the very best public services, and compared to other developed countries, it's also one of the most cost effective. At the moment, you see, we don't really have a proper private health insurance scenario in this country at all, because the private health insurance only offers certain kind of transactions. They like to keep it simple and they like to keep it profitable. So if there is any kind of problem where somebody's got two illnesses at once maybe, or they don't react to the drugs well, so you have to kind of find other solutions, or if there's any kind of complication really, the private hospitals don't deal with those people any longer, so they just refer everybody back into the NHS. People in this country seem to believe you can use private health insurance for everything, but the truth is they're not interested in anybody that's going to cost them money. So they will certainly make sure that if you are already ill, they charge you a lot, and usually they will exclude ongoing conditions. So it is very, very partial and very skewed, and frankly no use whatsoever to anybody that actually needs a lot of medical care. It's a great way for the insurance companies to make money, but it's a terrible way to deliver medical care. So at the moment, an awful lot of things are being done by traditional NHS providers. From the 1st April 2013, we will now have a regime where everything has to go out to tender, and the private contractors are considerably advantaged in winning those tenders. They design the rules. Basically, the tendering process happens, you have to pull together an application, a bid. Typically, it's about that thick stack of A4. It's quite highly technical, legally, financially and operationally, so just having medical knowledge isn't enough. You really need people who are very, very good on the legal and financial staff and are experts in bid preparation. So private companies, and I've taken contracts with some of these private companies in other fields, what they have is a dedicated bid team. They have a bunch of highly specialised technicals who do nothing but search for bids to apply for, prepare the bids and pull in the externals, the external consultants that they need to pay to get exactly the right technical expertise. And every time one of those contracts is lost for the first time into the private sector, it means that the public sector capacity to deliver that service disappears because there's nobody to pay the ongoing salaries. Once you move into the private sector, the healthcare won't be run in the same way as presently. They'll do it all in the way that makes them the most money, so it will look different. It will just look like the US system and not like what we've had previously. So, I mean, I'm sure, you know, the actual physical infrastructure won't change very much to start with, and certainly the logo will be the same. But the entire ethos and way of doing things and likely outcomes and transparency, all of it, that's going to be different. The clinical commissioning groups, the CCGs, they have been told that they are going to have a lot of autonomy and that they will be able to represent the interests of their patients. But what the regulations say is that commissioners will put out contracts according to competition law, and they will decide according to competition law. And if anybody that didn't get the contract feels that they don't like the decision and that it could be faulted on failure to comply with competition law, they are permitted to comply to the sector regulator monitor, which is required to enforce competition law. So once everything gets put through the market, the thing is that the CCGs won't actually have any autonomy in the matter. And the reason we have been told all of this stuff about GP empowerment and patient empowerment is firstly to lure the doctors into complying with this. They are belatedly starting to understand that this is being a trick. Because the second reason why GPs have been told that in CCGs they would have the chance to advance the interests of patients is because it's very important for our politicians that nobody blames them. So the public has been induced to believe that the GPs are taking over and will be in control. So in 5 years, when the whole thing is a complete chaos and you can't get decent care, it won't be the politicians' fault. Look who is in charge. What we need to do is move back to a public service model in which things are arranged so doctors can help people who are ill. At the moment, this reform is taking us in quite the opposite direction.